Bernice? Okay, well, we'll look into popularizing that for the next great name of 2023 or something. I hadn't forgotten about her or anything, but it had been a while since I had really remembered her. Bernice was my grandmother Helen's only sibling, nearly as close, they said, as a twin. They grew up together, and then they lived together at Oregon State University while they studied to be teachers, which they were until they were married in a double wedding. My grandmother to my grandfather Keith, and Bernice to our uncle Wilbur. And they both went on from there. Bernice and Wilbur went to Roseburg, where Wilbur would teach for many years, and my grandmother and grandfather went to Seattle and then stayed here briefly in North Portland and then moved across the river to the Bridal Mile area. And all of those things, of course, led to the existence of my mother and her sisters and brothers, and then eventually in a roundabout kind of way to me. Now, by the time I was old enough to really know Aunt Bernice, she and Wilbur were already retired. They were living in a retirement community called Capitol Manor in Salem, where we would go often to visit them. By the time I really knew her, Aunt Bernice was famous, or infamous, one could say, for two things. One was always hosting Thanksgiving dinner, and the other one was never sitting down, ever, especially not during the Thanksgiving dinners that she always hosted. There was just always something to do, and she would buzz around her apron, tending to every imaginable need. And if you think I'm exaggerating, I'm really not. Literally, this woman never sat down. There were always more rolls to take out of the oven. We eat a lot of rolls. And there was always somebody who needed more gravy, or the meat tray had become unbalanced between dark and white turkey. And then, just when you thought that no one needed anything, as the plate started to empty and people pushed back their chairs from the table, just when you thought, surely now she'll sit down, then it was time for pie. And the cream needed to be whipped, and the ice cream needed to be scooped, and then before you knew it, we were all out the door, remarking on the way home that none of us ever saw Aunt Bernice sit down, ever. And I tell you all this simply to help you understand that when I say I am sort of a doer personality, that this type of energy runs in my blood. It is baked into my genes. I can't escape it. There is always something to do. Always, always, always something to do. Which is, of course, why I've often bristled at this story about Mary and Martha, which any other doers can kind of understand, especially the feeling that maybe Jesus is shaming Martha a little bit for offering hospitality, which I would point out is a huge part of his ministry. I found it difficult because I know what side I'm on, and I know that I came by that very honestly. But recently, thankfully, I've been able to start seeing this story a little bit differently. Now, one interesting thing about this passage is that it comes right after the story of the Good Samaritan. You all remember that one? Which in one way makes this even more challenging to integrate for a doer like me, because in that story, Jesus says, you should always stop what you're doing to help your neighbor. And in the very next sentence, Martha says to Jesus, hey, I'm a little overwhelmed here. Can you tell Mary to stop what she's doing and help me? And Jesus says, no, Mary is doing just the right thing. Which seems totally maddening until you realize that this is exactly the situation that the very early church faced. The church that Luke was writing for, writing this gospel and the companion book of Acts. Maybe you remember this. It's at the very beginning of the book of Acts, the church has exactly this question. Because early Christians were so welcoming and so helpful, guess who showed up to church? A bunch of people who needed a bunch of help. And widows and other people who needed support. It was too much. And so the early Christians immediately got super overwhelmed. How can we help all these people and not lose sight of what we really came here to do, which is connect to God through this new way we've learned about in Jesus? Spoiler alert, part of their answer was to appoint folks called deacons. Deacons, pat yourselves on the back. These are people who could organize the work of diakonia, service to others, but more on that during the Presbyterian polity class, which will have when the weather's better. But making this connection really helped to shift things for me because it actually means that this story Jesus tells in Luke is speaking to a specific community need, not just to all doers out there. Clearly, Luke is trying to help by framing it in this way, pointing to the fact that the Christian life requires both work and rest, reflection and service, word and deed. And I get that. Do you get that? Do we have any doers in here? Do we have doers? I'm the only doer. It's about like 3 doers. The rest of you all figure this out. You can just meditate for the rest of this time. I believe that. But you know, it's hard to do. It's hard to do both those things sometimes. Whenever I've heard this story, my primary reaction is like, oh, okay, yes, rest and reflection, that's so great, but like somebody's got to whip the whipped cream, right? If y'all want to eat pie, someone's got to stand up and tend to it. Which was the stance I held for a long time about this passage until I recently read an interesting commentary which changed my perspective. And it was about how it's very likely that this story was much more about liberating Mary than shaming Martha. You know, Jesus didn't really seem to have any beef with Martha. Let's think about that. In fact, many times in his ministry, he used exactly the same word to describe himself and his mission that are in this story used to talk about Martha, serving others. As someone who is often literally crowded in on by people needing his help, I think surely Jesus understands. It's also notable that in this passage it's named Martha's house. She opened her house to them. This is a likely indication that Martha was an independent woman, probably one of the benefactors of Jesus' work. As I've said so many times before, it takes a lot of wealthy widows to support 13 unemployed guys who want to wander around and talk about the kingdom of God all the time. And I know that Jesus was not above offering constructive input to those around them who needed it. Remember that table-turning incident? But it doesn't seem like Jesus' way to come into his friend's house, who is serving dinner to his followers and underwriting his ministry, and tell her what she's doing is not worthwhile. That just doesn't sound very Jesus-like to me. It makes more sense to me that this story is really about Mary, about carving out some space for what she is doing. And it is true that in the first century Jewish culture, it was very rare for women to be able to learn things alongside men. More typical would be for them to hear about these things from their husbands later on. It was even more uncommon for women to join at the table before all of the cooking and preparation and serving had been done. So then it's sort of surprising to see that here is Mary stealing away from these expectations, defying some strong cultural patterns and her own sister's entreaties, and like elbowing her way into this circle of men so she can learn from Jesus. And she's praised for that. And I don't know about you, but for me this really transformed this story to one that was about comparison to one that's about liberation, about making room for another choice. And I realized reading it through that lens that Mary is not the only one who is empowered by that choice. I am too. Jesus has given me permission to tend to the reflective side of my life, even though I tend to be busy with and upset by many things, as Martha was. Jesus is vicariously at least giving me praise when I choose to tune into the present moment, to the sacred reality, to my own need for rest. The story is not about competition, about the best thing overall all the time. I think it's more about choice, about the best thing for this moment, for this time. And of course, when we're talking about choice in the church, we're talking about discernment, about seeking God's will in the moment, about what's important. Discernment from the Latin, to distinguish between. It's about choosing what to do not once, but all the time. About living eternally in a state of attention to God's invitation, which is sometimes an invitation to work our behinds off, and sometimes an invitation to rest and reflect and be fed. When you start looking, you see this all over Scripture, that the idea that it's not only what we do, but doing it in the right time. And I can appreciate that. I think there's a specific question here, a mantra of sorts. It's, God, what would you have me do and be right now? You ever ask yourself that? God, what would you have me be and do right now? I know I always have a long list of answers to that question, but what I'm seeking is God's invitation and input. And I think maybe as Christians we should be walking around asking that question 24 hours a day. And then, here's the hard part, actually listening to the answer and trying to do that thing. Because that is how we cultivate a spiritual life that is in tune with the tempo of God's movements. You know, as I mentioned at the beginning of this series, we live in a world that is always pressing us to be in Martha's role. But we step in here because in here there exists an invitation to do something different. To learn how to choose. To learn how to tune in to what God is saying. And then to enact that call irrespective of what the world around is saying about the validity of that choice. This passage for me, more recently, has become about knowing that Jesus is affirming us in those choices. Working through moments of grounding and connection that happen in prayer, and song, and worship, to keep us balanced. To make sure we don't become so absorbed in spiritual ecstasy that we completely neglect the needs of our neighbor, but also so that we don't become bogged down with the needs and cares of everyone everywhere, that we are never able to be present in the Holy One. Now, as an aside, I should say that the church is not particularly adept at tending to this balance. Unfortunately, we've been thinking about it for about 2,000 years. We haven't quite gotten it done yet. We still have some imbalance between those who commune and those who arrange. It'd be great to imagine together, how do we become a place where everyone participates and everyone rests? If you have any ideas on that, forward them to me. I'm just saying it's hard for me and for us to figure this out, how to do this. As I've also said before in this series, this is something that I myself find very difficult. In fact, I question my ability to be up here trying to teach you about it, but this is the path I chose and nobody else volunteered, so here I am. I think as a woman, as a parent, especially as a pastor, my over-functioning rarely feels like a choice. And to be honest, at times I can justify it by saying it feels like the highest calling there is. But when I reread this story and I see Jesus carve out space for Mary to sit down when no one thought it was her due, when he carves out space for her to gaze at the holy and to think and pray, I start to question whether sometimes I am missing out on something really important and deep. And I feel drawn into further dialogue with God about what exactly that might be. Every step along the way, I'm tempted to say, but God, this way of being is in my genes. And I hear God saying back, yes, and tending to me and letting me meet your needs is knit into your soul. So have a seat at my table. You are welcome here. And as often as you come, you will hear these words, she has chosen the one true food. That is my wish for me and for you and for us as a community. I hope God will continue to invite us into it. And I offer these prayers in God's name. Amen. We're going to respond in song. We will actually just sing this from our seats. It's a Taizé chant, so you're invited to just sing it a number of times. Heidi will guide us and just allow this to become your prayer.